As we move toward the end of the semester, and we've already covered all of the content in the book, one of the aspects of interviewing that is important to cover is the theoretical underpinnings to how we understand the helping relationship and the role of the helper, regardless of what type of interview we are doing. And so I'd like to now share with you a lecture on interviewing, the helping relationship, and theories of helping. So, the helping relationship, it is likely that you covered all of this information in your SWHS or your HSER 302 class. So, hopefully, I'm not providing with you this part, this early part of this lecture should not be much additional information. It might just be packaged in a way that might be a little different, but it's likely not things that you have, it's likely information that you've heard before. It also should be reminiscent of some of the things that you learned in chapters 1 and 2. So, human service professionals, and what I mean by that is kind of the profession, believe that the relationship is necessary for helping to occur. So, regardless of what theoretical perspective that you use, regardless of what role you play, case manager, intake interviewer, um, a drug and alcohol counselor, whatever you're doing, the relationship is necessary. And this relationship, the helping or the professional relationship, has two similarities to other relationships, or it has similarities to other relationships in our lives. One, you have people involved. Two, it involves communications and interactions. And three, it changes across time. It also, though, has some very key differences from other relationships, and that is that because there is the potential and goal of facilitating change, there's power innately in that relationship, and the helper holds more power, and therefore the helpee could be in a state of vulnerability. And there is a professional helper who is in that position to utilize skills and relational expertise to facilitate helping. One way that I like to think about this is that if our goal in our interpersonal, non professional relationships is to change someone, it's not going to probably be a very sustained relationship across time, because most people don't want to have friends, significant others who want to change them. That's not the same as being in friendships and relationships that help us grow. But if that's the primary focus is change and growth, that's likely not going to be sustainable. But the helping relationship is really about change and growth and support. And so that makes it distinctly different than our other relationships. So you've learned the 5 stages of an interview, but I also want to talk about the 5 stages of the helping relationship. So the helping relationship involves coming together and developing rapport. It involves understanding what's going on with the person. This is often in that 5 stage interview process. This is where you do the story and strengths. And acting together is all of the sets of interventions that you might use in that interaction. Even if you only interact with a person once and you just do like an initial intake interview, or even if you're just doing a follow-up conversation on the phone to check in. Let's say you're working for an organization and they want you to do follow-up check-ins with people to see how they're doing. Maybe they're seeing a therapist and they're receiving other services, and they have you be like a check-in. Even there, you're doing an intervention then, right? And you could be coming together and acting all in one. That might be it. The phone call might be the only time, but you're still trying in that interaction to develop rapport and work with them in that moment. And then the ending together is the solidifying the learning, or the making plan for their ongoing growth. Even if you hand the plan off, or part of the plan is to hand them off to someone else in the organization. So you can think of each of your interactions. Each time you interact with someone in the helping relationship, you likely go through 1, 2, 3, 4. And over the course of time that you see them, like each time you're going through the changes, like over the course of let's say you see them for a month, you go through coming together, exploring together, acting together, ending together that month. goes through each of, like, over the course of the month, you go through these stages. So as you're doing these helping, these interpersonal helping interactions, what guides you? We know now that you have a set of skills, but how do you use those skills? And how do you decide if you get into an organization, you know what your role is, you know what the goal is, how do you get there? This is where the theoretical perspective on helping is vital. And I want to suggest to you that people have answers to these three questions, whether they are explicit or implicit. So people have ideas about when other people need to change and what people need to do to change and what the helper should or shouldn't do and how responsible the helper is or isn't to help facilitate change. So people have thoughts and feelings about this. The question is whether they're aware of it and whether they're using a theory of helping that has been shown through research and through like established practice to work. So people often say to me, "Hey, Kalinda," or often, "Hey, Dr. Jones, do you think it's important that people pick a theory and use it, even if they're just doing like intakes or if they're just interacting with people like once in a while?" I'm like, yes, learn a theory, do a theory. Don't bounce around and do lots of random stuff. Because if you are, you're probably just using what you think might work, but you're not really focused in what you're doing. And you are actually using some frame of when you think someone what you think someone needs, how they're going to change, and what your role is. Like you've got some thoughts about that. But if you're not using some established professional theory, then you're using something, and it's probably personal opinion or bias or a mix of a bunch of things. So theories help us with this. Theories help answer these three questions, and theories also help us know what to do. They give us direction in the helping interaction because they explain when change is needed. And one of the ways they do that is by explaining what is healthy and unhealthy human behavior. They also help us know how people change so that we can facilitate it. And they help us know the roles and actions of the helper. Oh, Oh, I think these, sorry, the slides are out of order. I worked with Claude to produce this chart here, and it's a little overwhelming, and it's also not complete, but it is one way to represent the many, many, many theories of helping that exist, and to get to three of the ones that are three of um, the main like I guess thoughts, like theoretical arenas that I want to talk about, the theoretical approaches that I want to make sure that we cover in this class. So we're going to talk about the psychodynamic approach, which is here in red, the cognitive behavioral approach, which has both cognitive and behavioral embedded in it, which means it has behavioral separate. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the humanistic one, we're not going to talk about systems and postmodern approaches, and we're not going to talk about integrative or what Claude put in this other category. Under each of these, like under the red, there's all these other ones. And under the cognitive behavioral, there's all these other ones. We're not going to go into that kind of depth. But the reason that I wanted to have this humongous chart of psychotherapy approaches is for you to understand that we are just barely touching the surface of these, just barely touching them. And for you to know that there are in each of these distinct approaches, I think of them kind of as like over here is one kind of field or orchard, over here is another one, and over here is another one. These are very distinctly different approaches to helping. That within them there are different different approaches or different theories within the approaches. And I want to point out, and I'm going to do it when we get to the cognitive behavioral one, these are often continuing to evolve because the needs of people evolve, the needs of the field evolve, etc. So welcome to the overwhelming chart, but hopefully this gives you an idea. Now, the psychodynamic theory, or the psychodynamic theories, the psychoanalytic psychodynamic theories are actually what began with like Adler and Freud, and we're not going to start there. The cognitive behavioral ones came next, and then the humanistic ones came with Rogers. We're actually going to start in the orange with Rogers, and then we're going to make our way back in time. But these are set up kind of like in the order that they have evolved around time. Although the integrative ones actually started way back over here, but that's okay. All right, so let's talk about Rogers. We've already talked about this, so this should not be new. If you look at these things on the side here that I have, Abraham Maslow, you may have heard of him as from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there's some interesting things about Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you might want to learn about his hierarchy and him taking it from a group of indigenous folks in Canada, but that's a different issue. So let's get back onto Maslow, who was a humanist and who wrote around the same time as Carl Rogers. What a man can be, he must be. This need we call self-actualization. So within these theories of the humanistic theory of helping, Carl Rogers person-centered theory, we're talking about self-actualization, people becoming more their ideal self. And down here, this cartoon, all you ever do is ask me about my feelings. And oh, sorry. And the helper here, the interviewer says, and how does that make you feel? So this is this idea of reflection, this reflection of feeling. And this theory is what we've really been working on, you all learning how to do this semester, because I believe, and many people believe, I'm not alone, that this theory right here is the base of what the other theories require us to do. So learning the skills to be able to do this theory, then you can build on that as you do the other approaches to helping. So the goal here is self-actualization. Change will occur when people will become more their authentic or real selves, when the helper provides a relational environment that allows people to grow into their ideal selves. And so then obviously, if that's how change occurs, is in this healthy or ideal this relational environment, then the role of the helper is to create that healthy relational environment. And to do that, the helper will create these facilitative conditions for change. And Rogers talks about them being necessary and sufficient conditions for change. He talks about the genuineness or the realness or the congruence, the balanced internal, external state, the authenticity of the helper being one of the facilitative conditions that are necessary for change. The second one he talks about as accepting or caring or prizing the person that you are working with. And often we hear that as unconditional positive regard. That does not mean that you have to like the person. What it does mean, sorry. It does not mean that you have to like the person. What it does mean is that you have to honor and see their humanity. And so it could be called unconditional positive regard, but it could also be called acceptance, caring, or prizing, valuing the humanity in the other. So these two things are like attitudes or ways you approach, present yourself, come at the other person. And the empathetic understanding is using the skills that we talked about previously, the skills of active listening, the basic listening sequence, to gain an empathetic understanding of where the other one's coming, the helpee or the interviewee is coming from, and to understand the world as if you are from their perspective. So one of the things I want you to think about at the end of each of these theories that I'm talking through here is, what's your reaction to the theory? Like, what are your feelings about it? What are your thoughts about it? Is there a time you've witnessed it or experienced it? Hopefully, with this one, you've seen aspects of it in class this semester. Have you seen it in your interpersonal relationships? What about it do you vibe with and might you use? So we will now transition from the humanist theory, which is Rogers' theory, to the behavioral and the cognitive theories. So we're going to start with B.F. Skinner. Um, I will just note that this is the lecture of the old white guys. So the top picture over here. Oh, keep having problems with my good grief. Sorry. My mouse over here keeps hitting my mug and my water bottle that I have sitting here. So over here is the B.F. Skinner and his pigeons. And he's here with these pigeons. And we're going to talk about him first because he's the behaviorist. And then we'll talk about Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, who took behaviorism and added a cognitive component to it. So we'll talk about the cognitive. Okay, it's that one was just my finger. I can't even blame the the mouse hitting anything. It was just my finger. So anyway, let's talk about B.F. Skinner and then we'll go down to the cognitive theorists. So B.F. Skinner, he comes on the scene after Freud, and we'll talk about Freud in a second. So there was Freud, and then there was Skinner, and then there was Rogers. And Beck and Ellis are kind of like in that time with like after Skinner and around Rogers' time. So Skinner comes on the scene after after Freud, and we'll talk about him in a second, but he's all about the unconscious. And Skinner's like, it doesn't matter what's going on deep in your mind that you're unaware of. He's like, everything is about the environment. It's everything is about what can be reinforced, what people can learn, what they can be punished for. Everything is reinforcement and punishment. And it's the way that punishment, classical conditioning, it's the way you may have learned it in psychology. So anyway, he says, give me any baby in the world and I can make them anything that anything. I can make them I don't know exactly what he said. I'd have to go back and look again. It's been a while since I've read it, but I can make them a garbage man, a teacher, an astronaut, the president. It doesn't matter. I will make them anything through a series of reinforcement, a series of things that I reinforce behavior and then they do what I want them to do, or I remove things from them through a series of punishments and they will change their behavior. This is behaviorism. And so it's a series of behavior modifications, and the change occurs through external things in the environment. We actually still see this happening today in psychology. We see it used a lot. Behavior modification, we see it used in like group home settings. We see it used in autism. We see it used in maybe in some places we'll see it used in other like settings, like adults with like maybe adults who are living in situations, maybe adults with lower IQs or something like that are in some kind of like group home living or that are living in some kind of supervised housing, so that there's this kind of like, you do these things, you get these rewards. Any of that is kind of based on this behaviorism. We also see it in schools, right? And most broadly, we see it in the kind of carceral state or in the prison system. So it's interesting to think of our society and think of ways that behaviorism comes into play. And I would encourage you to think about this in terms of ways that behaviorism has been in your life, ways you've used it in your life to try to change your behavior or to change others' behavior. The emphasis on the environment needing to be like reinforcing the behavior is one of the aspects of this theory that is interesting, I think, to think about. So that's behaviorism. And then along with behaviorism comes the cognitive theories. So Beck and Ellis come on the scene and they say like, well, this is interesting. Behavior is important to talk about, but we also need to talk about the link between behavior and thought. So that yeah, we have this issue of behavior, but really there's this issue of like how people are thinking. And so that really the idea is that healthy thoughts are going to lead to thoughts to healthy behavior and healthy emotions. And that if people have irrational thoughts and irrational cognitions that, or what Ellis called stinking thinking, then that will lead to unhealthy behavior. So this is the idea of like, what's the problem? And for Beck and Ellis, the problem was cognition or unhealthy or irrational thinking. When you work with people in this type of helping, you stay focused on the present. So the cognitive theories, obviously, if the problem is the thinking, then you change the thinking. Sometimes you'll change the behavior, and then you'll talk about how the behavioral change is linked back to changing the cognitions, because cognitions and behaviors are interrelated in this theory. But the root is, well, the thing that you're really going after is changing the thoughts. So the helper is going to help people understand that their thoughts are messed up and that they then need to practice changing their behavior. One of the things that helpers do in this theory is that they do a lot of educating about this idea that people have irrational thoughts or that they have unhealthy cognitions and that they need to understand the way that thoughts affect their behavior in their life. And then they need to work to correct or to have more healthy thoughts. So helpers will challenge irrational thoughts. They'll help with goal setting. They'll help with kind of self-awareness goal setting so that people can understand their thoughts and behaviors. They can try to make small changes in their thoughts and behaviors. This often involves homework, role playing, practicing things like positive self-talk or involved in exposure. Aaron Beck called this cognitive behavioral therapy, and Ellis called his, first he called it RET, rational emotive therapy, and then he added the behavioral component toward the end of it as it was evolving. He called it REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy. So this is kind of the second thing we're talking. We talked about Rogers, and now we're talking about behaviorism and cognitive theories. Specifically, we're in the cognitive theories. I'm not going to necessarily go in depth with this cognitive model, but the reason I put this here is because what in my experience right now, a lot of people that have had a lot of my students who have had therapy with people using CBT. And I think it's important for you all to understand what theories were used if you were in therapy. So it's likely that if you were in therapy, someone using cognitive behavioral therapy was using this kind of an idea of the emotions, behaviors, or physiological responses were not the problem. The automatic thoughts were cueing those reactions, and then if you were in therapy, people were teaching you to get back to recognize your automatic thoughts, to get back to your intermediate beliefs, and then to get back to the core beliefs. And to do that, all of these things on the side, first creating rapport, and then making goals, and then educating about this whole thing and trying to understand your cognitive model. This would have been the process that was going on if someone was really following cognitive behavioral therapy with Aaron and his daughter, Judith Beck. So there are core beliefs that people will try to understand in cognitive behavioral therapy. And so there's a set of helpless core beliefs and unlovable core beliefs, which again, if you've been in cognitive behavioral therapy, you may have learned some of these things or been introduced to them. And then also one of the things that often people have been introduced to, if they've been in any kind of group therapy or self-help groups, they may have been introduced to these kind of cognitive distortions. Again, this is connected back to the cognitive theories, which is why I added here, because I want people to be more aware of what they've seen And it's not uncommon for people with like an associate's degree or a certificate to participate in and even facilitate groups that get people to think about their irrational thoughts, get people to think about their cognitive distortions. But then I kind of wonder, like, do people understand how this is connected back to like a bigger theory? And I want you to be aware of that, which is why I added this. So the other thing I want you to know is that we didn't just start with the behavioral theories, the rational emotive behavior theory and the cognitive behavioral theory. We didn't just like start and stop there. Those were what we would have called, like in this chart, we have behavior theory, therapy, and then we have the second wave theories, the REBT and the CBT. And then we have what would be called the third wave, which is kind of what's happened since then, which is the dialectical behavioral therapy, which is being used a lot in California in group home settings to run a lot of those psychoeducational groups. A lot of the work that's happening there comes out of Linehan's work. And a lot of the skill-based stuff in psychoeducation that people are doing is coming out of dialectical behavioral therapy. We see a lot of mindfulness, cognitive therapy stuff going on. Again, I see that going on in psychoeducation groups. And acceptance and commitment therapy kind of came out of that. Like, you can't change all your thoughts. Sometimes you just have to be aware of them and you have to let it go and you have to vibe with the stuff that's shitty in the world. And there's some acceptance commitment therapy stuff that happens. And the schema focused cognitive therapy. The reason I'm showing you this is because I think it's good to know that these theories are always evolving, but also this stuff is like alive and well for people who might be working like on the ground. If you get done with this degree and you're like, I want to go and get an on the ground job working with youth in a group home or something, you will see this theory in action right now in Sacramento. Like, it's happening in group homes right now. And so I think it's good to have a context of what in the world's going on and how people are thinking that the rest of the setting is supporting what's going on in therapy for people, and how you as a worker or a helper in that setting are working to support the therapeutic change or that's going on, or the change that's going on for the individuals. So that's cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive therapy, and behavior theory. So as you think about, I guess I could have added behaviorism to this chart. As you think about behaviorism, CBT, and REBT, what are your feelings and thoughts about it? Where have you seen it? Where have you seen it working for you? Have you experienced it? What about for other people? How might you use it? How might you envision yourself using it? Give yourself an opportunity to reflect on how this applies to you and how it intersects with the skills of helping. All right, next we're going to talk about Freud. Now I'm going to talk about him very briefly. Primarily, I want to get to transference and countertransference. But Freud was he's not the very beginning of this. We often talk about him, but he was like a real, like, one of the things about Freud is that he was a scientist and he was really a researcher. He wrote so much. He wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And so part of why I think he lives on is because of so much of his writings. Um, so he created some of these ideas, brought some of these ideas together, and he came up with a human personality theory, and he defines like what is healthy and unhealthy. But it's important to kind of understand his theory of human personality. So if we come over here to the iceberg, if you took psychology, you have probably studied this before. So one of the things that he talks about is that human personality starts in childhood, and that these early childhood experiences are foundational to who we become. And so understanding what happened here, well, let's just start there first. What happens in the first 12 years of life is vitally important for who we become. And as we're developing, we develop a conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. That's how our mind, our spirit, our soul develops. And so this part over here, right, Freud was really trying to understand the mind, or what might better have been translated as the spirit or the soul. He wrote in German, so we're always trying to come back and, like, translate what he said. So what we see here is the conscious is what we're aware of. That's the top of the iceberg here. People aren't necessarily born with these things, like they develop across time. The pre-conscious is what we could access with some work, with some digging. You have to, like, get down in the water and you could pull some things out and look. Maybe you need some, like, some scuba, like, gear or whatever, but you could get down in there. And then the unconscious is largely unavailable to people. So the idea that you could just get like some implicit bias training and get at some unconscious bias, that doesn't really exist in Freud's theory, just FYI. Preconscious you can access, unconscious is very, very difficult to access. So simultaneously, as we understand this part of the mind, it's also in Freud's theory to understand that there is an id, ego, and superego. The ego is the part of ourselves that is in touch with reality, that we're able to see reality, we're able to be rational, we're able to understand ourselves and others and the world, and we can communicate about that, explain it, understand it, etc. That's the ego. Now, the id is the part of ourselves that is driven for pure pleasure or pure death. So he also talks about thanatos, which is kind of the death instinct. So the pleasure instinct and the death instinct are here in the id. And this is kind of all out, like, not self-control, none of that. It's just good, 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 or feel good, feel good, feel good, or the opposite of that, just kind of like death, death, death. So it's excessive, it's extreme. It doesn't have any, like, boundaries on it. That's the id. And then over here we have the superego. The superego is the part of us that gets created as the external rules in the environment become internalized for us. And we get these messages about what's appropriate and not appropriate. And it has the same kind of extremeness that the id has, but it's like, be extremely perfect, do all the rules, do them exactly right all the time. And so I think I have on the next slide. No, I don't have it. I should have kept that picture on here. So when one of the things that people talk about with Freud's idea of the id, the ego, and the superego is that, like, the ego is right here in relation to reality, and then you have the id over here, which is like the devil, and you have the superego over here, which is like the conscious. And it's like our person inside of us, we're pulled in all these different directions to do great and be wonderful all the time, or to do terrible and feel great, or feel good all the time. And that's kind of this pull that's inside of us. So healthy people are able to balance the pull between the superego and the id. And unhealthy people are unable to balance the superego or the id. And so the superego or the id kind of controls behavior, and it will overpower the ego and warp reality. And whichever one is more in control. And denial is, I think, I'm not going to go through all of these. The defense mechanisms, if you haven't studied them, they're very fascinating. We can see them at action, I think. If you think about these, you'll see them in action a lot right now. But a denial, not believing reality, is like the example of this. So someone does something that is very harmful to someone else. They're unable to, like, literally believe that they did it. And that would be just like pure out denial. They're not believing reality because their ego is not strong enough in Freud's, they're not healthy enough in Freud's theory to be able to stay focused or to be able to be in touch with reality. I could go all the way through these, but the defense mechanisms are interesting if you care about Freud's theory. So what do we do in this theory, given the fact that you have these competing pieces of the self self, you have the role of the unconscious, you have early childhood development, and then you have a tendency to run from reality and to either be kind of consumed with the ego, the superego, or consumed with the id. This is kind of the essence of his theory. Well, we know that what happened was likely some shit that happened in the past. That's what we know with his theory. And that the way that things are going to get changed is that whatever you couldn't handle in the past that caused you to use one of these defense mechanisms and store up unresolved stuff, it's going to need to be understood, and there's going to need to be a resolution, and that stuff happened in interpersonal interactions. So the helper needs to help people understand, um, through the uncovering of the preconscious or the unconscious, to help people come through and get like an emotional release or a catharsis, essentially to like pop the emotional zits that are all infected down there in people's preconscious and unconscious, and to come to to relational understanding of the way that patterns are continuing. And so there's a bunch of different things that helpers can do, both long term and short term. And one of those things, all of these are pretty much interpersonal, but some of it is to address, to like work with the transference and countertransference that's in the helper-helpy interaction. So in this theory, in Freud's theory, transference and countertransference aren't bad; they just are. It's just the projection of the unconscious into the helper-helpee interaction. It just is. It's to be expected. So psychoanalytic is the long 3 times a week, sit on the couch, talk to your interviewer. Um, and psychodynamic is a shorter version of that was developed post-Freud. So I left this in here only because some students are very interested in attachment theory. And for the sake of time, let me see, oh, it's not as long as I thought it was. Okay. I might go a little bit into this, but I also don't want to spend too much time on it. But one of the theories, so there's numerous theories that developed after Freud's theory, and one of them was attachment theory. And attachment theory is one of the ones that's kind of I don't want to say making a rebound, but that people are really paying attention to as we're understanding the neurobiological basis of psychological, I don't want of psychological distress. Maybe that's one way you could say it. People Freud's theory is kind of making a little bit of a rebound because some of the stuff, Freud was a medical doctor and then he went into the psychological emphasis as an MD. And so one of the things that is happening now is as we're understanding neurobiology better, is that some of the people who are writing are going back to Freud's work and kind of finding what Freud and what the people post Freud were doing, and seeing how that's connecting to our more modern understanding of the brain. And attachment theory is one of the places that this is going on. And so some people really like this theory, and some students who have early childhood, um, like trauma or have had attachment difficulties, this makes a lot of sense to them. And so I like to pull this out because I've just found that students like this theory. So John Bowlby, actually his writing is fascinating. I have all 3 of his like essential books that he wrote. But he looked at the world of biology. He looked at imprinting with like ducks and things like that. And he said like, oh, well, people are born, babies are born and they're pretty like vulnerable and they need safety and security. So they're going to like look to their parents, their primary caregivers for security and to get their needs met. And as they cry out to get their needs met, as they signal to the environment that they get their needs met, they start to develop some internal cognitive structures. Their brains are developing, something's going on, and they're getting some cognitive models of who they are, what the world is like, and who other people are. And this has to do with safety, will their needs get met, etc. and that these kind of internal working models, cognitive models of who they are, what the other people are like in the world, and what the world is like, these early attachment patterns, these are going to persist throughout adulthood. This was Bowlby's theory. So he talks about healthy and unhealthy attachment styles, and he does the work, and then Mary Ainsworth comes along and she develops the attachment, develops an assessment to kind of assess the types of attachment patterns that babies and children have. And that, and she does that kind of globally, which solidifies this theory. And oh, I guess before I talk about how we do therapy with this theory, and because she did this globally, it solidified the theory, and also the research on this theory has been shown to be persistent across the lifespan. So he hypothesized that what happens when the baby's needs get met or don't get met by the primary caregiver will affect how they interact with their friends in, middle school, their partner in adulthood, will affect how they parent their children. This was his hypothesis, and sure enough, we found now that attachment styles indeed do persist across the lifespan and intergenerationally. It affects the way that people parent across generations, and therefore attachment styles go across generations. Doesn't mean that attachment styles can't change. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that the research is this is one of the lines of research that is pretty robust. So, what do you do therapeutically about attachment styles? Well, obviously, the focus is on the past because the problem was the early caregiver interactions and the internal working model of self, other, in the world. Again, these are cognitive models. So, the change happens by understanding and resolving the past attachment patterns. And this includes changing the internal cognitive models of self, other, and the world. The therapist serves as a secure base so that the client can explore new ways of relating to self and others, can experiment with new ways of relating to self and others. And there's a bunch of different things that the therapist can do. The book up there, A Secure Base, is Bowlby's book on therapy. He worked a lot with adolescents who were delinquent. I guess that's the word that we would use. All right. So the last thing I want to cover here before we kind of come to a conclusion here is transference and countertransference. So let's talk about Freud's theory in terms of transference and countertransference. One of the things about Freud's theory and about transference and countertransference that I think is important for us to realize is that in the helping interactions, it doesn't matter whether you're a therapist or whether you're just, doing an intake or doing crisis counseling or interacting with someone who is in crisis. When you're a professional helper, especially when someone is vulnerable, their unconscious stuff is going to come up. Like people's stuff comes up. And people's stuff involves both what's going on now and what's gone on in the past. And so it's important to understand that when we talk about transference and countertransference, we're talking about the psychological energy from people's lives in the past. I don't mean past lives, I mean from their childhood on. Past lives is a different issue. I'm talking about Freud's theory here. So, in Freud's theory, which is where transference and countertransference comes from, it's a projection of past stuff from early childhood. um, People's unresolved stuff will energetically come out, right? So if you think of like people have psychological, like unresolved, like diarrhea and I don't know, vomit, and it's stored there and it's festering and it's gross. And then they're like keeping it under wraps, and then they get stressed, distressed, and you remind them of their mother or their father, and they don't have a lot of emotional energy, and you're not helping them, or you're talking to them a certain way, and then they're giving you the current energy of their distress as well as the past stuff. So some of that diarrhea and vomit will just come out at you. This is what, when we talk about projection and we talk about transference and countertransference, this is what we're talking about. And when it comes at you, if you don't know what to do with it, then you can get pulled into it. You can get like, like react to it. And if it reminds you of something in your own life and activates your own vomit, diarrhea, and unresolved stuff, now all of a sudden we got people vomiting and diarrheaing on each other, which can result in the loss of objectivity, unrealistic expectations, exaggerated response, and a bunch of other nonsense, right? And I shouldn't say nonsense because this is just the difficulty of the human experience. This stuff happens all over the place. Somebody triggers someone else, and then that person triggers the other person, and people are triggering each other back and forth, and we got, triggers. So what the reason I want to talk about that here is that I think often we talk about transference and countertransference like without the knowledge of the psychological energy that's behind it, or what Freud called the psyche, right? And it's not just, I don't know, like a clinical term, like something in a hospital. It has more weight to it than that, and it has much more energy that pulls people in, which is why it's still important to know, and it is not just related to the therapeutic interaction. It happens to all of us in the social work human service profession. So to be clear, I think you've probably studied this before. Transference is when the energy, or when something happens for the client that they project it onto the helper. Countertransference can occur two ways. It can happen when the helper's own stuff gets transferred onto the helpee for any reason. That person reminds them of their mother, it reminds them of their brother, it reminds them of whatever, right? And transference and countertransference can be good. It doesn't always have to be bad, but it still can result in loss of objectivity and unrealistic expectations, romantic involvement, etc. Over familiarity, it can result in a lot of things. So it can come from the helper to the helpee. It can come from the helpee to the helper, or it can be that back and forth thing where the helper sends it or the helpee sends it, and then the helper also responds to it. So then you have that kind of cyclic thing going on. So I've talked about Freud's theory. I talked about attachment theory. I talked about transference and countertransference. And I'd like you to think about your feelings and thoughts in relation to this theory. Think of times that you've seen aspects of these theories in action when you've experienced them in ways that you can envision them coming into your work, and maybe ways that they would intersect skills that you could use in relation to them. Oh, I'm really struggling here with the slides today. All right, so we did psychodynamic theory last, cognitive behavioral theory in the middle, both cognitive and behaviorism, and we did humanistic theory. So the red, the green, the orange. I didn't do the other theories, and I'm not going to. There's many other ones. Some of the weaknesses to what I covered is that I covered the theories that are like, these are foundational theories for much of the things that we do in the field. But what's largely missing, if you look at the pictures of the people that I put up there, they're like all like white folks. So there's other theorists, they just aren't considered foundational in the field. And so that's a different issue in the whole field of psychology that's problematic. We can see a narrative theory and some of the postmodern theories will see like more room for more voices, but still, yeah, there's a cultural blindness, and an assumption of normativity around white maleness and white heterosexual maleness, educated um, males in the field of psychology. This is a real big problem in the field of helping that we want to be thinking about and considering in the way that we adapt the interviewing skills. So, as you think of how to apply the skills of helping You're going to be working with people, and they're going to, in theory, be coming to you for change and assistance. And you'll be asked to think about what about their behavior needs changing? What of their behavior do they think needs changed? How can they change? What role are you to play? What role should they play? What should you do in response to their need for change and their request for help? The theories will help you, the skills will help you, your cultural background will help you, and hopefully things will help you that you are still, going to be things will help you that you will be learning both the remainder of the semester, but far into the future. I hope that this presentation on theories, intention, or on theories and interviewing has been helpful. And I look forward to talking about it more in class.